Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so as you remember when I was talking to you about the first video, your introduction about the Industrial Revolution, I told you that mostly all the time, whenever there was an Industrial Revolution, there were other revolutions that went along with it. Most of the time, transportation and communication. So here is where we're going to go over the transportation and communication results from the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So communication, what are the effects on communication? You can see it right there, the Morse code, right? In 1832, Samuel Morse created a functional telegraph. The telegraph was a device that could send information over wires. Like, look at those telegraph wires right there. One of his associates created what we call the Morse code in order to communicate over those wires. And here's what it would do. The telegraph was a little machine that when you clicked two metal pieces together, it would form an electric current. Bzz, 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 bzz. And the longer you held it, the longer the buzz, or the click is what they called it, these clicks, right? It click, 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 right? And what the person did is they took these series of clicks and they made them, what they started to call them was dots and dashes. And that's what you get, that dot and dash for the Morse code. They arranged those dots and dashes into patterns, which would represent letters of the alphabet. And you could do it with the telegraph over the telegraph lines, click, 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 right? Or you could do it with lights, right? The Navy and submarines uses it in lights. You know, they would just click lights that in the same type of code. They still use the Morse code today. So in 1844, the Morse code really caught on with the telegraph when the nomination for the Democratic National Convention was sent over telegraph to Washington, D.C. And what you have to think is when the railroad grew, so did the communication. The telegraph grew with it. Because when they put railroad tracks down, they would lie the telegraph lines next to it. And the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed in 1861. And now that's for the Civil War, towards the beginning of the Civil War. And when we cover that area, and you're going to cover the transportation now, we're going to cover and see that most of those railroad lines and telegraph lines were located in the north. Okay, so there's no surprise that that was a big benefit for the North during the Civil War, more railroad lines and more telegraph lines to communicate better. So communication was the Morse code, the telegraph really expanding because of the Industrial Revolution. But what about transportation? During the Industrial Revolution in the United States in the 1800s, it really gave rise to that transportation revolution, which was a period of growth in a new means of transportation. You have to remember, 16s, 17s, early 1800s, it's mostly horse and carriage. But this transportation revolution, two new forms of transportation in particularly would be the steamboat and the steam-powered trains. Remember what I said, you have a boiler. If you look at that train right there in the top right, that long cylindrical part in the front, that's horizontal with the ground, it's parallel with the ground, that would hold water in it, and there would be a fire behind that, and it would boil that water, and it would cause steam, and that steam would drive that engine. So you have this now steamboat, which is steamboat, it works the same way, and these steam-powered trains really starting to move people faster. It creates a boom in businesses by reducing shipping costs and shipping times, right? A lot faster than horse and carriage, and we'll cover that in a minute. So think about your theme of geography, human environmental interaction, goods, people, and information were able to travel more efficiently and quickly across the United States. So that's a big theme about the human environmental interaction. The transportation revolution really hits that one hard. So we're going to first cover steamboats because that was really the first thing. And right there, Robert Fulton, he creates this steamboat called the Clermont. And that increased trade by moving goods more quickly up and down the rivers rather than on horse and carriage. And by 1840, there were more than 500 steamboats in use. But I wanted to tell you something about the steamboats, right? So the first steamboat, Robert Fulton, the Claremont, he's testing it to go up and down the Hudson River. Okay, it's going from, I want to say, the city up to Albany. And they're trying to make the time. That trip from New York City to Albany would take about 4 days by regular, wind carried vessels. But this steamboat was able to make that trip in about 30 hours. So it's really speeding up the travel of information, goods, and products. And like I said right there, many exploded. What you have to remember is these steam engines would catch fire, and these boilers would have so much pressure in them that if it didn't get released properly, it would explode. And about 22% of those were really because of boiler explosions themselves. So steamboats were pretty dangerous. They caught on quickly because of the speed, but as more and more exploded, they kind of went to the wayside with the introduction of the trade. So now what happens about regulating trade in Gibbons versus Ogden 1824? So we're looking at the idea of interstate trade or trade between the states. On horse and carriage, it's easy to stop somebody going from one state to the next. But when you're on a river, who's to say where the state boundaries are? Who's to say when you can and can't stop them? So this guy Gibbons argues that a federal license meant that he can travel from New Jersey and use New York waterways without another license. He said the federal license is a good enough license. We are part of the United States. This idea of federalism, the United States, the central government can control so much, and then the state's government controls the rest. Just like a passport being a United States ID and your driver's license being the state ID. Gibbons is arguing that, hey, listen, I have this federal ID, this federal license to trade. You should not have to try to stop me between New Jersey and New York and, tax me or something like that. The Supreme Court actually sides with Gibbons, saying, yes, the federal government has control over interstate trade. The states don't control that. The government does. So we get into steam-powered trains. You have the Tom Thumb up on top right there, and you have the a map of the United States with, you can barely see it, but there's some red lines on there. Let's go into the steam-powered train. Originally developed in Great Britain, it took about 30 years for the idea to catch on in the United States, and it caught on in about 1830 when Peter Cooper raced his Tom Thumb, which is that image up on top, against a horse-drawn rail car. People were not sold on the idea of a steam-powered train. You can see that there's people in the bucket and you got the train up front. Peter Cooper said, hey, listen, I have this idea for a steam-powered train, and it's going to use all these same tracks. And people are like, yeah. And he's like, listen, it's going to go fast. And they're like, yeah. And he says, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put this up against a horse. Right? We know how horses can run. They can travel really fast. So if your horse can beat my train, I'm done and it's over. So people are like, yeah, okay, deal's on. So you can see the Tom Thumb has a group of people with it when the horse only has, one guy or two guys on a carriage. So the race is off. The Tom Thumb is cruising. It's going about 10, 15 miles an hour with all these people on it. It's kicking the butt out of this horse. Unfortunately for Cooper, the Tom Thumb actually breaks down. But really the proof of the power and speed, despite losing to the horse, because after the Tom Thumb broke down, the horse actually ends the race in first, and people are like, oh, the train lost. But people are like, if we can get the idea of this steam train to work, man, it's really going to catch on and we're going to do good. So if you could tell by the map right there, the northeastern part of the United States has the most amount of railways by 1960. Overall in the United States in 1860, there was about 30,000 miles of track. 22,000 miles were located in the northeast. 8,000 miles were located in the south. When it becomes a civil war, it is those railroads that really become a benefit to the north. They can transport soldiers, weapons, telegraph lines. They can make messages faster, and they can just really outperform the South in transportation. As the railroad grows, so does the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is surging due to railroads being able to make things move faster, cheaper, and more efficient to distant markets across the United States. For you, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. It's celebrated with a golden spike. Take a golden spike, right? Like a big nail, hammer it into the ground. Duk, 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 celebrate. Hey, let's drink champagne and celebrate and shake hands. Let's go ahead and yank that spike right out of the ground, okay? It's very important. I mean, it was a solid gold spike. So in Promontory, Utah, the East and the West are finally connected, as you can see in that picture right there. They celebrate it with a golden spike. Parades and cheers erupt across the United States, and everybody celebrates now that the East and the West have met. So now people everywhere across the United States have access to products made from far distances away. The railroads contribute to things like the expansion of the borders, especially in the southwestern part of the United States, right? With that Gadsden Purchase down there, built for the Transcontinental Railroad, or purchased for the Transcontinental Railroad. So now we can expand the United States. Our National Park Service just goes crazy because of the railroads, because now everybody from the east can travel out west and see all those beautiful lands. Cities and towns are just booming up, boom towns along the railroad tracks. Prosperity and the nation, and in a really big love of patriotism of the United States. The train essentially helps create the coal industry. They are using coal now. They're done using wood, because after they used all that wood and deforested all those areas, that's it. We needed another source of fuel, and coal is it. So coal, as trains get bigger and faster, coal is shipped cheaper. It's mined cheaper. It's fueling things in homes. It emerges with the steel industry. The lumber industry grows. Cities grow. Chicago, New York become transportation hubs in the United States. So the steam-powered riverboat and the steam-powered train are really two big transportation effects from the Industrial Revolution. And really that telegraph line later into the telephone with Alexander Graham Bell are really huge communication revolutions that came from the Industrial Revolution.